She boarded the wrong plane and became the most humiliated woman in America. That's the central shock of today's story. And yes, it all started with one wrong gate, a powerful man with a cruel sense of humor, and a single video that turned into a national spectacle. This isn't fiction. This is the kind of story that could happen to any of us in the blink of an eye. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, enjoy the story. It was supposed to be just another tired Monday for Clara Miller, a 28-year-old waitress in a roadside diner off the I-95 in New Jersey. The kind of place where the coffee tastes like regret and the customers don't say thank you. Her life moved between clinking plates, thin paychecks, and the steady fading of her grandmother's memory. When the phone rang and she heard the nurse say, "She's not doing well," Clara didn't hesitate. She clocked out, wiped her hands on her apron, and rushed for the nearest airport with one goal: get to Florida before it was too late. There was no Uber money, no time for planning. Just instinct, desperation, and a series of frantic questions thrown at a half-asleep airport employee who, distracted, pointed her toward a sleek private jet parked just off the main terminal. Clara, out of breath and trembling with a printed email from the hospital in hand, climbed aboard the jet, completely unaware of the absurd mistake. She didn't belong there, but she didn't know it yet. Inside the luxurious cabin, silence turned to smirks as she stepped in. The faces turned, sharp suits, diamond earrings, expensive colognes. At the center of it all sat Austin Blake, 45 years old, billionaire CEO and the cold architect behind one of the most ruthless financial empires on Wall Street. He was a man who made headlines not just for his business moves, but for his unapologetic arrogance. To Austin, pain was profit and inconvenience was comedy. So when Clara stumbled in, out of breath, clutching her hospital email and apologizing for being late, he saw it not as a mistake, but an opportunity for entertainment. His assistant began, filming almost on cue. "Ladies and gentlemen," Austin said loud enough for everyone to hear, "a glimpse into the American education system. Apparently, airports no longer require literacy." Laughter exploded. Clara froze. She looked around, confused, then embarrassed. She tried to explain about the nurse, her grandmother, the mix-up, but no one listened. The pilot hesitated at the door, clearly unsure. Austin waved him on. "Escort her off. Kindly." Two security men approached. Clara didn't resist. She just blinked, confused, then walked out slowly, her eyes scanning each laughing face like a puzzle she was too tired to solve. When she turned back at the door, her eyes met Austin's. No anger, no drama, just a look that said more than she could ever scream. "I didn't think people like you actually existed." The video hit social media before she even made it to the terminal. It was titled, "Ignorance with Altitude." Austin, grinning beside her blurred face, made a mock apology in the caption. "Next time, check your ticket, sweetheart." Within hours, it was everywhere. News outlets debated it, memes multiplied, late-night comedians dissected it with glee. Clara's quiet shame became a national joke. Meanwhile, she was back in the terminal. No flight, no apology, just a quiet corner and a vending machine coffee. A kind airline attendant with soft eyes and zero cameras in sight gave her a bus voucher. "It's not fast," she said, "but it gets you there." Clara boarded the Greyhound just before sunset. She sat in the back. Her phone buzzed nonstop, with strangers' opinions. She turned it off. Through the window, the road stretched endlessly, blurring past neon signs and dark fields. No one looked at her. No one asked questions. The world outside didn't care about viral moments. It moved at its own tired pace. As the wheels rolled on into the night, Clara leaned her head against the glass, wiped her cheek without a sound, and disappeared into the hum of the engine. And in that quiet, the storm had only just begun. The video that had humiliated Clara didn't vanish like most viral clips. It festered online, growing teeth. But what Austin Blake hadn't predicted was the shift in public sentiment. For a moment, people laughed. Then, as the days passed and news anchors played her silent, stunned face one more time, the laughter curdled into discomfort. Sponsors began pulling out of Austin's ventures. The board of directors started asking questions, not about profit margins, but about decency, optics, and damage control. For a man used to bending the world to his will, the silence that followed was worse than any headline. Late-night shows that once praised his brutal candor now dissected him like a cautionary tale. He didn't understand. In his world, power forgave cruelty. Clara, meanwhile, arrived in Florida unnoticed. Her grandmother was still alive, barely, and Clara spent those last days in quiet vigil, brushing the woman's thin hair, whispering stories of better times. Outside the hospital room, her name was rising for different reasons. A producer at a local news station had seen the video, not the version with mockery, but one with no edits. Just a woman being humiliated and not retaliating, not performing. She reached out gently, without offers of fame, just an invitation to speak if she wished. Clara ignored the call at first. Then, on the third try, she answered. Not for revenge. She simply didn't want the last word to belong to Austin. The interview was nothing flashy. A chair, a mic, and Clara talking plainly. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. She spoke about her grandmother, about the job she held for years, about how most people don't need to be fixed, they just need to be seen. The segment aired during a quiet Sunday slot, not prime time, but people watched. Not in a rush, not in outrage. They watched with stillness. Something about her sincerity cut through the noise. Within days, letters arrived at the station, some from women who saw themselves in Clara, others from strangers who hadn't cried in years until that interview. She didn't trend. She resonated. Meanwhile, Austin doubled down. He booked speaking events about freedom of speech, resilience, how cancel culture threatened innovation. He hired PR experts, lawyers, even psychologists to coach his tone. But the problem wasn't his image. It was him. The halls where he once commanded respect now echoed with absence. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. Clients stopped returning calls. Invitations dried up. And slowly, Austin realized something worse than being hated, being irrelevant. The market moved on. The world, it seemed, had grown tired of men like him. Clara went back to her old job, but something in her had changed. She spoke less, moved more deliberately. The customers still barked for coffee, still didn't tip, but she stood taller now. She started getting handwritten notes from viewers, some slipping them under the diner's door. One woman left a package, a set of cloth napkins embroidered with quotes from Clara's interview. "You make being invisible feel like a choice," one said. She laughed softly at that, then folded the napkins and took them home. She didn't seek validation, but she accepted grace. One morning, Clara received another call, this time from a small production company running a new kind of reality show, not about wealth or vanity, but about survival. Emotional, practical, personal. The show, titled Beyond the Weight, asked nothing of her but truth. No makeovers, no dramatic reveals. Just her, as she was. At first, she refused. Then, after a long walk and a quiet night sitting by her grandmother's now empty chair, she changed her mind. She didn't want a platform, but maybe her silence had done enough. Maybe it was time to speak on her own terms. Austin, now alone in his penthouse, watched the world move on without him. The executives he once mentored now ignored his calls. One evening, he opened a letter addressed to his office. Inside was no threat, no insult, just a handwritten note from an 83-year-old woman. "You don't know me," it began, "but you made me feel like I didn't matter. Not directly, just by how you laughed." There was no demand, just quiet disappointment. He read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his drawer. He didn't know why. Clara's appearance on Beyond the Weight wasn't glamorous. She wore no makeup. She didn't rehearse. She sat on a plain couch and spoke about her childhood. The nights she locked the bedroom door while her father screamed in the kitchen. The mornings she walked to school with the taste of silence in her mouth. She didn't try to make it poetic. She spoke plainly, because pain, when real, needs no decoration. Viewers responded in waves, not with applause, but with stories of their own. The network expected decent ratings. What they got was a movement. After the final episode aired, Clara declined every interview. She received offers for book deals, merchandise, even podcasts. She said no. Instead, she started a small workshop for local women who had left shelters or toxic homes. She taught them how to create household linens with messages of real endurance, not inspiration, but validation. "You don't have to be fixed to be valuable," one read. Orders came in quietly. She never advertised. One afternoon, at a corner store in Newark, Austin stood in line behind a couple who were examining one of those linen pieces. He recognized the handwriting, the style. They spoke about how the message felt honest. He said nothing. When they walked away, he touched the cloth briefly, not with ownership, but with something like apology. Then he left. Clara, back home, finished wrapping a set of napkins, then sat by the window where the sun caught the dust in the air. Her hands ached slightly, and her heart, though steadier, still trembled now and then. But she no longer feared that trembling. In a world that once laughed at her silence, she had found the power of speaking only when it mattered. And for the first time in his life, Austin was beginning to understand that silence, too. Clara never intended to be a face for anything. After the show ended, she returned to her quiet routines. Early shifts at the diner, weekly visits to her grandmother's grave, the steady stitching of cloth in a modest backroom where she now taught for women how to sew without rushing. What surprised her wasn't the attention that still trickled in, but the strange calm that followed it. The world had watched her break and rebuild without theatrics, and now that they'd moved on to the next sensation, Clara found herself strangely grateful. She no longer needed to defend herself. There was peace in the ordinary, and that was enough. But fate, as always, had a different appetite. Months later, a low-budget reality show called Beyond the Wait contacted her again, not to feature her, but to invite her back as a quiet mentor for a new batch of participants. No spotlight, no camera focus, just her presence behind the scenes. She almost said no, but when she met one of the women, a former nurse who hadn't spoken to her son in 6 years, Clara felt that old, familiar pull. Not toward fame, but toward usefulness. She agreed on one condition: no scripts, no expectations. Back in Manhattan, Austin was unraveling. His reputation had become a liability. Investors fled, offices emptied, and lawsuits once buried reemerged. With teeth, every attempt to rebuild was met with cold doors and polite refusals. For a man used to commanding boardrooms and bending policy, rejection stung like rot. He kept telling himself it was temporary, that the world loved a comeback. But in private, he couldn't sleep. He drank more. He paced his penthouse in silence, the lights never fully on, the mirrors covered. He had fired most of his staff and now cooked his own meals badly. And though he wouldn't admit it, he watched Clara's interviews late at night, alone, headphones in, face unreadable. That Clara's new circle wasn't glamorous, but it was loyal. The women in her workshop didn't idolize her. They shared bus fare, brought leftover fabric, told their stories only when they felt like it. Together, they stitched sentences onto linen and flannel, sentences that echoed broken hearts, unfinished apologies, and rare courage. Orders continued arriving, modest but consistent. One day, a retired senator's assistant ordered 50 units for a charity dinner. Clara agreed, but refused to appear. She preferred to stay where her voice didn't need a microphone. And yet, the senator herself had other plans. Months later, she extended an invitation for Clara to attend an annual gala in New York. Clara declined at first, but her grandmother's words returned to her. Don't show up for them. Show up for you. With hesitation, she accepted. The dress she wore wasn't bought, but made, stitched by her own hand, helped by the women in her workshop, a muted blue that reminded her of the sky outside her old bedroom window. She arrived alone, unnoticed at first, blending into a sea of glittering people who didn't know her face. But some recognized her, not with celebrity awe, but with quiet respect. She nodded, smiled, said little. Austin, surprisingly, was also there. He was thinner, paler, but wore the same expensive fabric. His presence didn't command attention as it once did. Now he moved like a man passing through a room that used to belong to him. When he saw Clara from across the hall, something in him faltered. He hadn't seen her in person since that humiliating morning on the jet. He walked toward her slowly, rehearsing lines in his mind, but forgetting them with every step. When he finally reached her, she looked up, expression unreadable. "Miss Miller," he said, voice lower than he expected. "Could we talk for a moment?" She nodded once, stepping aside with him to a quieter corner near the coat check. The room buzzed behind them, uncaring. "I don't know how to start," he admitted. She didn't help him. She waited. He tried again. I was wrong. Not just about that day, about a lot of things. People, worth, silence. You showed me that. He stopped. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just a moment. Clara studied him, not with suspicion, not even pity, just a kind of measured attention. When he finished, she offered her hand. He took it. Her grip was strong, firm, unshaken. She didn't say, I forgive you. She didn't need to. After that moment, they didn't speak again that evening. Clara returned to her table, exchanged small pleasantries, and left before dessert. Austin stayed longer, not to mingle, but to sit in quiet. Something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. He left alone, walking the few blocks to his apartment instead of calling for a car. The weeks that followed were quieter still. Clara expanded her workshop, not with more employees, but with more purpose. She connected with a local shelter, bringing materials to women who couldn't leave their homes. She started writing messages not only on napkins, but also on blankets, sent to hospitals and retirement homes, each one stitched by hand. No mass production, no logos. Austin sold off the last major share of his company. The deal made headlines briefly, but people were already distracted by newer scandals. He bought a smaller place in Newark, not to make a statement, but because it felt more manageable. He began showing up at a community center under a different name, sitting quietly at evening classes about civic engagement and ethics. No one recognized him. He didn't correct them. Then one day, Clara received a letter. No return address. Inside, one line, carefully written, I still don't understand everything, but I'm learning to listen. She folded the paper and placed it inside the same wooden box where she kept her grandmother's glasses, a pressed daisy, and the original bus ticket from New Jersey to Florida. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But she held it for a long time. Life, she had learned, didn't offer closure. It offered continuity. And in that quiet thread between endings and beginnings, she had stitched something stronger than forgiveness. Dignity without performance, presence without noise. The gala wasn't about power this time. It wasn't about display or posture or visibility. It was about presence. Clara stood near the entrance of the grand ballroom in Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by people who moved with practiced charm and measured steps. She wasn't dazzled. She'd spent too many hours in hospitals and bus stations to be fazed by chandeliers. Her dress, though simple, carried weight. It was made by the same hands that had stitched cloth in her quiet workshop, crafted with stories that would never make headlines but lived permanently in the seams. She wasn't there to dazzle. She was there to remind herself she belonged anywhere her feet took her. She had only agreed to attend because the woman who invited her, former Senator Helen March, had spoken without flattery. Helen had watched Clara's reality show with tears in her eyes, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. She sent a handwritten letter, not a public appeal, and included only one line that mattered. Sometimes we need people who've walked through fire to stand quietly among those still holding matches. Clara folded the invitation 3 times before accepting. She moved through the room deliberately, not drawing attention but not shrinking from it either. Some guests approached her, mostly women, offering soft praise, quiet thanks. Clara listened, more than she spoke. She accepted compliments without letting them settle too deep. Her table was modest, tucked near a wall, and she was content with that. She noticed that the loudest people in the room weren't necessarily the strongest, and the ones who had the most to prove said the least. Then she saw him. Austin Blake entered the gala with hesitation in his step. There was no entourage this time, no flash of wealth, no camera flashes trailing him. His suit was still tailored, but his shoulders had lost that rigid confidence. He looked smaller, not in size, but in presence. A few people acknowledged him, with brief nods. Others avoided eye contact. He didn't scan the room for attention like before. He looked for one person only, and when his eyes found Clara's, he froze. For a moment, neither moved. He took a breath and started walking toward her, slowly, as if unsure if the floor beneath him would allow it. Clara watched without flinching. She didn't feel anger rise. She didn't feel pity either. She felt readiness. "Clara," he said, as he reached her. His voice was steadier than the last time they'd spoken, but carried the same effort. "Would it be all right if we spoke for a minute?" She nodded, guiding him a few steps away from the crowd, to a quieter alcove near the coat room. The noise behind them faded into background. I've thought about this moment a lot. He began, not performing, just speaking. Not because I expected anything from it, but because I didn't want to avoid it anymore. You didn't deserve what I did to you. I used you as entertainment. I turned your pain into content. And when the world turned on me, I blamed them. I never looked at myself. Clara stood still, hands folded. She didn't interrupt. Her silence wasn't passive, it was pointed. I don't expect forgiveness, Austin continued. Honestly, I wouldn't know what to do with it. But I needed to say this in person. Not because it changes anything for you, but because it changes something in me. There was a long pause. Then Clara extended her hand. It wasn't an act of grace. It was a statement of self-respect. When Austin took it, she gripped firmly, looked him in the eyes, and said only, "Thank you for speaking." Then she let go and turned back toward the ballroom. The conversation ended there, not with closure, but with completion. Clara didn't stay long after that. She had never enjoyed large crowds. As she left the venue, her shoulders relaxed. She walked through the cool Manhattan air with no cameras trailing her, no headlines waiting to pounce. It was just her, a woman who had lived through public shame, and emerged with her name intact, not because she fought loudly, but because she stood quietly in the storm until it passed. The next day, the gala made minor news. Clara's name was mentioned briefly, tucked into a paragraph about rising civic voices. Austin's presence was noted without fanfare. No drama, no scandal, no reinvention narrative. Just a gathering where once opposing lives brushed gently. In the dark, back in her town, Clara returned to the workshop. The women were waiting, some curious about the event, others focused on fabric. Clara gave no long speech. She described the evening as fine, and they returned to their needles and threads. What mattered wasn't what had happened, but that she'd returned exactly as she had left, untransformed by prestige, unmoved by spectacle. Austin, meanwhile, spent the following days canceling the few speaking engagements he had left. He turned down offers to revive his career on talk shows or podcasts. He no longer had an appetite for reinvention. He stayed in his small apartment in Newark, walked to grocery stores, sat in quiet cafes, and avoided telling people who he used to be. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to sell and nothing to hide behind. That he found a letter again. In his drawer, the one from the elderly woman who wrote, "You made me feel like I didn't matter." He read it again, slowly, then wrote a reply, not to send, but to understand. He wrote pages about his father's coldness, his need to control everything, his fear of being forgotten. When he finished, he folded the pages and placed them next to the original letter. He didn't feel relief. He felt truth. And for now, that was enough. No one posted about the moment at the gala. No photos went viral. No hashtags trended. But in that quiet exchange between a woman who had endured and a man who had fallen, something irreversible shifted. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't triumph. It was what came after both, a stillness that finally made space for change. The months that followed passed quietly, but not without consequence. Clara no longer felt like a footnote in someone else's spectacle. She had taken her story back without needing applause. Her workshop continued, still small, still intentional. She refused to grow it into something commercial. She wasn't building a brand. She was building dignity, one stitch at a time. The women she worked with didn't wear name tags or uniforms. They worked in silence, sometimes laughing, sometimes not. The orders came in steadily now, mostly from word of mouth. Napkins, blankets, hand towels embroidered with lines that felt like the opposite of marketing. You don't need a spotlight to matter. Strength is not loud. Stillness is not surrender. Clara didn't design slogans. She remembered truths. She never mentioned Austin again. Not because she forgot, but because she had placed that story on a shelf where it no longer needed dusting. The gala hadn't transformed her. If anything, it reminded her that she didn't owe anyone drama. The moment between them, his apology, her response, was something finished. Not resolved, not wrapped in a bow, just finished. She'd learned the hard way that healing doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes in the form of walking home alone, hanging up your coat, and sleeping without bitterness. Austin, on the other hand, faced the slow collapse of the world he had once ruled. His company continued to fracture, sold piece by piece, to competitors who had no interest in legacy, only leverage. The market had turned ruthless again, only now it had no use for his particular cruelty. The suits were younger, their arrogance sleeker. He wasn't needed. He stopped trying to salvage anything public. He no longer gave interviews or responded to articles speculating about his downfall. When someone tried to bait him into a podcast appearance by offering a six-figure fee and a promise of controlling the narrative, he declined without hesitation. Instead, he walked miles a day through neighborhoods where no one looked twice at a man in a simple coat with a paper cup of coffee. Sometimes he paused in small shops. Sometimes he sat in parks where mothers herded toddlers in coats too big for them. It was in one of those walks, inside a quiet corner market in Newark, that he saw the napkins he hadn't expected it. There, stacked between soy candles and handmade soaps, were cloth napkins folded carefully, each with a stitched phrase that made him pause. He picked one up and read it. "You are not what they remember. You are what you keep." He didn't need to see a signature. He recognized the words the way you recognize a voice in a dark room. He placed it back and stood there for several seconds, his hands in his pockets, not moving. A couple nearby discussed the item like it was something quaint. He just listened, quietly, and then left. That night, he sat at his small kitchen table and didn't turn on the lights. He lit one candle and opened a folder of papers he hadn't touched in weeks. Legal documents, financial reports, letters from lawyers. He started signing, one by one. Final sales, account closures, disclosures. The final chapter of his empire, signed not in defiance, but in deliberate acceptance. He didn't rush. He read everything. And when he was done, he poured himself a glass of water and placed the pen back into the drawer. Clara had no idea this was happening. Her world didn't track stock indexes or executive movements. She was busy adjusting the sewing machines, ordering bulk fabric, and delivering care packages to a local hospice. Her aversion to the spotlight remained, but now it was paired with something firmer, a refusal to waste time on appearances. Life had given her a clear lane, and she intended to stay in it. One day at a time, one woman at a time, one thread at a time. That week, a woman named Rosalind joined the workshop. She had scars on her hands from years of factory work and a stutter that made her avoid eye contact. Clara didn't ask questions. She gave her cloth and space and let silence do the work. By the third session, Rosalind had stitched a line of her own onto a scrap of linen. "I am not broken. I am in repair." Clara placed it on the shelf beside the others. It sold online within hours. Austin received no headlines when his last company division was dissolved. He moved through the transition as quietly as possible, retaining only enough assets to live simply. When an old acquaintance sent him a text, "When's your comeback?" he didn't reply. He deleted the message and continued reading a book on post-war social ethics. It wasn't for show. It was the first book he had finished in years. The world didn't cheer for either of them anymore. And, strangely, that was the point. Clara had stopped needing the world's validation, and Austin had stopped mistaking attention for meaning. They lived in parallel now, not intertwined, but not indifferent. Two people reshaped by the same storm, walking different streets in the same city, each carrying a kind of peace that came not from victory, but from understanding. There was no revenge, no comeback tour, no viral apology. Only small actions carried out with consistency and care. A woman sewing in silence. A man learning to exist without control. The world kept spinning, louder than ever. But somewhere beneath the noise, they had each found a quiet rhythm of their own. Austin Blake now lived in an apartment that echoed more than it impressed. It had hardwood floors, one bookshelf, and no art on the walls. The silence that once felt like punishment had evolved into something tolerable, even necessary. He had stopped measuring days in meetings and contracts. Now he measured them in walks, pages read, and the rare conversations he didn't initiate. The city no longer bent for him, and he no longer needed it to. He blended in easily, another man in a worn coat riding the subway, observing life from a quiet distance. People didn't ask who he was, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like answering that he began spending time in small libraries and community centers, places where success was measured by stability, not spectacle. He took notes in margins, listened to lectures, and found himself more often on the receiving end of knowledge than the giving. No cameras, no applause, just chairs and rows and voices talking about ethics, sustainability, and the psychology of regret. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even reinvention. It was rebuilding from the inside out, one unremarkable day at a time. Clara's world kept its rhythm. The workshop expanded slightly, not with staff, but with reach. Local hospice centers began requesting personalized linens for their patients, messages stitched with care, not as slogans, but as soft farewells. "You mattered to someone," one read. "It's okay to let go," read another. Clara didn't choose the phrases to comfort the dying, but to remind the living that endings could be gentle. She rarely looked at the news. Her days were filled with hands-on tasks: packing, sewing, guiding, listening. Her husband, a firefighter named Jonah, supported her without intrusion. Their life was not grand, but it was whole. The kind of quiet union that didn't need words to prove itself. One morning, Clara received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, steady, masculine, practiced. Inside was a single line: "I'm still learning how to listen." She read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the box where she kept a few chosen items: a cracked bus token, her grandmother's favorite brooch, a photo from the workshop's first day. She didn't feel stirred or confused. She felt clarity. Growth, she knew now, was not a dramatic event. It was subtle. It was often invisible. And it didn't require an audience. Austin had written that letter after sitting for hours in the same chair where he used to conduct video calls with shareholders. He no longer had shareholders. He didn't miss them. He missed something else, something less clear. Perhaps it was the feeling of being useful, but without dominance, or the longing to be seen without being feared. Writing that sentence to Clara hadn't been a gesture for her. It had been a declaration to himself, a mark in the sand, a signpost that said, "I'm not who I was. I may never be what I want to be, but I'm not finished." The city kept moving. Neither Clara nor Austin appeared in articles anymore. The world had found new scandals, new faces to glorify and tear down. Social media barely remembered the video that had once sparked outrage. The algorithm had digested it and moved on. But the people who had watched closely, the ones who felt something shift that week, hadn't forgotten. Not in the loud sense, but in the way that lives are quietly adjusted after witnessing a truth that can't be unlearned. Clara's husband occasionally asked about Austin, not out of jealousy, but curiosity. Clara answered honestly, "He was a different kind of storm, and I outlasted it." That was all. They never spoke his name around the dinner table. Life didn't need reminders of battles already won without violence. Austin began volunteering at a local college, offering to guest lecture once a month in business ethics. The irony wasn't lost on him. He didn't pretend to be wise. He simply told stories about deals made without conscience, about the cost of efficiency when humanity is the price. The students listened, not because he was famous, but because he was honest. Brutally so. He never used Clara's name. He never needed to. The lesson was always the same. Don't measure power by how many doors you can close behind you. One evening, as Clara was closing the shop, a woman walked in with tears in her eyes. She had just come from the hospital where her mother had passed, wrapped in one of Clara's blankets. She didn't want anything. She just wanted to say thank you. Clara hugged her, then turned off the lights and sat alone for a moment. She didn't cry. She felt something deeper than sorrow. She felt usefulness, a quiet purpose that didn't fade with applause. That same night, Austin stood at his window watching the street below, a notebook in hand filled with half-formed thoughts. He didn't write plans anymore. He wrote questions. What does legacy mean without admiration? Can atonement exist without witnesses? If no one ever sees the change, did it still matter? The questions didn't haunt him. They shaped him. They had met only once since the gala. A brief encounter in the park, no words exchanged, just a nod from a distance. And yet, it had been enough. They were not enemies, not allies, just two people who had shared a moment that neither would forget, and both had used it to change in ways that defied spectacle. Their lives now existed in the margins. Not irrelevant, but refined. Not forgotten, but free. Because sometimes, after everything has fallen and silence takes over, what's left is what should have always mattered. Grace without performance, worth without noise. And that, quiet, solid, earned, is what they each now carried. Fine, the wedding was small, as Clara had always imagined it. No spotlight, no excess, only the people who had earned a seat at her table. Jonah stood beside her, not as a hero, but as a partner, steady and present, a man who never asked her to explain her silences. The ceremony took place in the garden of a community center, surrounded by laughter that didn't echo off marble, but carried through soft trees and folding chairs. Her grandmother's photograph rested on a table near the cake, next to a vase of wildflowers. The cake was modest, the food cooked by neighbors, and no part of it was shared online. There were no hashtags, no filters, only the sound of a life being lived sincerely. Austin watched from afar. He hadn't been invited, nor did he expect to be, but someone who knew someone had sent him the link to the live stream. He didn't tell anyone he was watching. He sat alone in his apartment, the screen glowing faintly, his notebook beside him untouched. When Clara appeared on screen, smiling in a simple dress she likely made herself, he felt no longing and no regret, just a strange kind of quiet pride. Not in himself, in her, in what she had done with what the world had given her. He watched until the last guest left the frame, then closed the laptop without applause. The following months settled into an even quieter rhythm. Clara continued the workshop, but now with new hands, young women, older women, those still learning how to live again. The business never advertised, but never lacked for demand. She kept her presence small and her mission sharp. Her voice, when it came, always came with purpose. She didn't explain her success in interviews. She didn't need to. Her actions were stitched into fabric and placed in homes where silence and survival coexisted. Austin began teaching part-time at a community college. The course, called Decision Making and Consequence, attracted a mixed group, some fresh out of high school, some older and curious, all skeptical at first. He never told them who he was. Eventually, someone would search his name, recognize the face, ask questions. He would nod and say, "That was me. Now let's talk about what happens after that." He never spoke of Clara by name, but her presence lived in every lecture, in every case study, in every story that carried the weight of misused power. One student asked him if he thought people could change. He answered without hesitation, "Yes, but not when they want to prove it, only when they stop needing to." Clara became a wife without changing who she was. She didn't abandon the past, nor did she romanticize it. She and Jonah moved into a modest house, the kind with creaky floors and space to grow herbs in the kitchen window. The neighbors knew her not as a symbol, but as the woman who always had an extra casserole when someone got sick, who never missed a community cleanup, who kept her phone off during meals. She didn't chase peace. She built it. Her grandmother's old chair now sat in the hallway, reupholstered with fabric Clara had embroidered herself. On it, a single stitched phrase, "We continue." No flourish, no signature, just the truth. Of it, Austin's days remained structured. Mornings spent reading, afternoons teaching or walking, evenings in stillness. The world around him, once a stage he ruled, now felt like background music to a smaller, more deliberate existence. He didn't resent it. He'd come to understand that some lessons only arrive after the applause dies. Some dignity can't be reclaimed. It has to be rebuilt in quiet spaces, among people who don't care what you used to be. When a local journalist reached out for a profile piece titled, "Where are they now?" he declined with a short reply. Let the past rest. He no longer felt the need to correct the narrative or revisit the viral moment that had once defined both of them. That story had ended. This one didn't need an audience. Jonah, ever respectful of Clara's past, rarely asked about Austin. Once, while they were folding laundry together, he said, "Do you ever wonder if he's okay?" Clara didn't look up. She replied simply, "I hope so, but that's not mine to manage anymore." And that was the last word spoken on the matter. Her life, now rooted in gentle routine, was not without challenge. The workshop faced funding issues. Her grandmother's chair broke again and needed repair. The world, beyond their window, was as loud and chaotic as ever. But none of it shook her. The storms of noise and opinion no longer reached her front door. She had weathered something far more brutal and walked away whole. There were no more reunions, no dramatic reckonings. Clara and Austin would not cross paths again. They didn't need to. What had passed between them lived in the fabric of who they had each become. She, a woman who proved that dignity doesn't require vindication. He, a man who learned that absence can be its own form of healing. And so they continued, quietly, fully, each in their own space, shaped by what they endured, defined by what they chose afterward. Years passed without announcement. The world, always hungry for noise, had long moved on. New scandals filled timelines. New heroes replaced the old, and the viral video that had once thrust Clara Miller into unwanted infamy slipped quietly into digital oblivion. Search results changed. Algorithms forgot. But for Clara and Austin, the consequences of that moment never dissolved. They settled, deeply, into the choices that followed. Neither of them spoke of it anymore, not out of avoidance, but because it had done its work. It no longer needed to be named. Clara walked her life now with a kind of grounded steadiness that didn't require explanation. Her workshop remained small by design, still producing handcrafted linens with embroidered phrases that had stopped trying to be profound and instead became real. Today is enough. You are not what they expected. We go on, even quietly. The orders trickled in, never in volume, but always with intention. Her team was a rotation of women who came and went as needed. Some stayed, others moved on, all left a mark. Clara never forced them to tell their stories. She offered thread, space, and time. The rest was theirs. Her mornings began with silence, coffee, light through the curtain, a quiet check on the herbs in the windowsill. Jonah was often already gone, out responding to calls, his presence lingering in the warmth of the coffee he left poured for her. She never asked for grand gestures. The little ones were enough. Once a week, she still visited her grandmother's grave, usually with a fresh napkin folded into her coat pocket. She never spoke aloud while there, never recited memories. She simply sat, letting the quiet do its work. Austin's life remained discreet. He had kept his word to himself. No return to industry, no attempt to recapture relevance. He still taught twice a week at the community college, never missing a class, always early, always prepared. He never mentioned his past unless it served the lesson. His students respected him, not because of what he had been, but because of how attentively he listened now. In those rooms, his voice was measured, his insights offered not as doctrine, but as open-ended questions. He asked more than he answered. It wasn't humility performed. It was a man learning how to be small in the right way. On his birthday, he didn't celebrate it. He received a brown envelope. Inside was a cloth napkin, familiar in design. It read, "Stillness is not failure." No signature, no note, just the stitch. He placed it on his kitchen table and didn't move it for weeks. Eventually, he framed it, not to display, but to protect it. That small object, sent without fanfare, was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging each other again. And it was enough. Clara never confirmed she sent it. She didn't need to. Her life had long moved into a space beyond confrontation, beyond reconciliation. She wasn't trying to prove forgiveness or signal closure. The stitch wasn't a message. It was a gesture, a thread connecting two paths that had once collided violently and now existed side by side, without touching. In the final months of winter, Clara found herself walking more. Sometimes alone, sometimes with Jonah, often without destination. She said little on these walks. Her thoughts didn't swirl anymore. They settled. She had once feared being invisible. Now she found power in being quietly necessary, to her work, to her husband, to a community that didn't need her name to know her worth. Austin, on a similar path, began tutoring one of his former students, a young man unsure of his direction, too proud to ask for guidance. They met weekly at a coffee shop where no one recognized either of them. Austin brought no business cards, offered no networking tips. He simply listened. And when the student once asked, "What made you change?" Austin responded only with a pause, followed by, "There comes a point when you get tired of being the loudest one in the room." Late in the spring, Clara received a letter. Not from Austin, from the senator who had invited her to the gala years earlier. It wasn't long, just a thank you. The woman had seen one of Clara's pieces hanging in a hospice she now volunteered at. She didn't mention legacy or inspiration. She only said that seeing those words, stitched in soft thread, helped her speak to someone who couldn't speak back. Clara folded the letter and placed it in her grandmother's old jewelry box. Some acknowledgments don't need to be displayed. Neither Clara nor Austin ever became public figures again. They didn't need to. Their stories no longer lived on screens or in headlines. They lived in rooms filled with quiet effort, with soft light, with conversations where no one raised their voice. They lived in linens folded neatly in strangers' homes, in questions asked with sincerity, in the absence of spectacle. And so, the woman who was once laughed at for boarding the wrong plane, and the man who had turned her into content, each found their way into quieter lives. Not simpler, not easy, but true. Their transformation wasn't marked by grand moments or speeches. It revealed itself slowly in what they built, what they let go of, and how they carried the weight of their choices without needing to explain them. They would never meet again. But somewhere between her morning coffee and his late-night notebook, scribbles, they continued, apart, but not entirely unconnected. The thread between them, once frayed and brutal, now existed only in the background. Faint, steady, quiet, enough.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.